I'm doing an impromptu video on a book that I just read because I'm so moved by it, and it's really urging me on to do greater things and to be a better man. I think all of us need that, and we need the tales and exploits of men who went before us that can challenge us and gird us on to be better than we could have been. So what I want all of us to do is be farther than we are right now. You got to tap into stories of the past, bring it into the present, and mold those together to forge a better future. Ernest Shackleton is a new hero of mine. I wasn't aware of what his story was. He was an explorer in the early 1900s. He did 3 Arctic exploration missions. One of those I want to go into great detail now, and holy smokes, buckle up, guys. Now, you could spend 12, 15, 17 hours reading the book Endurance. I highly encourage you to, but here's a quick few-minute summary so that we can look in, and I'm going to give you some observations. First off, let's understand Shackleton. A man's man. This guy is tough as nails. I've done tough stuff, but compared to Shackleton, bro, I would take my worst day anytime compared to the suffering that he and his men endured. Anyway, let's lean into Shackleton. His most famous expedition, he was attempting a trans-Arctic voyage. He was going to come right off the coast of Chile. He was going to go to Antarctica there. He stepped off at South Georgia Islands, went into the Arctic, and he's going to get off his ship, walk across the continent, pick up on the other side, and go straight to Australia. Now, Shackleton, when he gets close to Antarctica, a bunch of ice starts moving in, this big pack of ice, and traps his ship. Now, his ship, thoroughly stuck, has millions and millions of pounds of ice crushing in, and the guy's living aboard and trapped in the Arctic with no support, no rescue ships, and no way to communicate with the outside world, is being crushed more and more and more until the ship begins to break and it's smashed into oblivion. Now, before this happens, they unload, and so they're just out in the middle of an Arctic wasteland, just exposed to the snow, gale force winds, and it's just a bunch of dudes out on the ice. Now, they lowered 3 boats, like rowboat, open concept. They had a pack of dogs that they would eventually eat later for food, and they're just living on the ice. They tried to cut across, but because the ice is impacted and kicking up all these ridges, it might take 12 hours to move 1 mile. So immediately the expedition is dead in the water, and all they can do is just wait. They live on the ice for months and months, waiting for this huge landmass of ice to hopefully drift north so that the ice will start to melt some as summer is coming on, and hopefully try to escape. Now, they're enduring throughout this time the worst cold imaginable. They're living in Antarctica. One certain night, while men were sleeping in their tent, the ice just opened up and somebody disappeared down into the crack in the icy water below. Shackleton, on the ball, comes in, rips the guy out just in time for having the ice close back up and smash him. He almost died right there. Now, having the ice beneath them start to deteriorate, at the last moment, they load boats and they push off north, trying to escape this big pack of ice that's constantly trying to crush them, as the boats are getting swamped with waves of salty water so that they're freezing constantly. Weeks and weeks go by until finally they land at this tiny little island called Elephant Island. This is an uninhabitable land. It's just basically icy glacier, misery index off the chart. The boats get off there, they refit, they kill some seals, they kill some penguins. However, they recognize all their resources are dwindling down. And so Shackleton makes the decision that him and a few other dudes are going to get in the best of their little open concept rowboats, about 22, 23 foot long. And he's going to load up and he's going to attempt an 800-mile journey across the most trepidatious, dangerous seas in the entire world, the Arctic Ocean, and try to land at the little island of South Georgia. Now, if their navigation isn't perfect, they'll miss it. Furthermore, they'll encounter waves that are 20 feet high, 40 feet high, 60, 80 feet high. As waves are picking them up, throwing them down, they're going through these gale force storms. Ice would be freezing up on the boat so that they would become so heavy that it would sink the boat. And so they would have to get out on the bow while waves are crashing over with a little hatchet, break up the ice, and then try to heat the boat with a stove to melt the ice in the bottom so that they could bail the water out as more water is constantly bailing in. For weeks, they have to do this. Now, when this one boat does land at South Georgia to get help to bring back to rescue all those who are estranged on Elephant Island, they land on the wrong side of South Georgia Island. Now, when they land, the landfall is so devastating coming up on all these rocks that they break their tiller. What that means is they're not able to get back in their boat and sail around to the port where they could get rescue. Instead, Shackleton takes two dudes and they go across an Arctic mountain range. It is the most agonizing, terrible thing. Years later, after this expedition, expert climbers with full gear tried to replicate the thing, and they went on this basic route that's similar to it. It's called the High Pass. But Shackleton did the lower pass, which the climbers to this day do not know how he did it. It's never been replicated. And he only did it with a 50-foot strand of rope. Finally, they descend in sight of a whaling village and realize that there's no way to actually get down except to jump off a waterfall into the water below. Of course. And so they do that. And then they make it to the whaling station. From there, they'll end up getting help. They'll end up getting their buddies in South Georgia and then later to Elephant Island. It'll take months and months to recover. But what's interesting is they did not lose a single man in this entire exploit. Now, leaning into 2024, I want to take some observations to this story because here's something that I know. Going into 2024, our world is breaking at the seams. There's a famine of strong masculinity that needs to be daringly and with long suffering, with determination, with boldness, bearing up our society and the problems that abound. The problem isn't somewhere else. The problem is you and I need to grow stronger. That's what needs to happen. Not someone else, just you and me growing to be better, stronger men. That's the goal. That's the desire. And these past examples can whisper to us and have us gird ourselves up to do more and be better. Now, here's something. The copious amounts of journals that were kept by these men on this great expedition showed that very few of these men were ever complaining. They didn't complain. They did the hard work of survival. They took care of each other, and they didn't complain. Not being a complainer is really important for a few different reasons. One is complaining shows an ingratitude of spirit, which cuts you off from being able to do hard things. Complainers don't accomplish great feats, ever. Furthermore, they're sociologically toxic. They bring everyone down. They lead to dissension and then a breaking up of all organizations. Now, in our daily struggle, it isn't a battle of life and death in the sense that these men experienced. And so we can give our complaining and our ingratitude and our contempt and our upset full vent. In fact, that's what most social media is. The world is filled with weak men and society is collapsing because we're not there to support it. But the answer isn't to just sit back and say, woe is me. I just bring up the point to urge you and I on to be better. Recognize this. There's no way to make a man and to keep a man strong except that he endures suffering. That's it. Whether the school of hard knocks imposes that upon us, because life and responsibility in general should be tough. A man is given strength so that he can bear his own burdens so well that he has margin to bear the burdens of others, those around me, and hopefully as I grow stronger, I can support more and more and more. And so could you. Second observation has to do with Shackleton the man. He was an unparalleled, charismatic, enigmatic leader. Incredible. Of lots of studies on leadership have been done about Shackleton, and I knew that going into this book, and so I was very curious to look in. It was interesting in that when he got all these applications from his riveting ad that he took out in the newspaper, he got hundreds of applications, but typically you wouldn't spend more than 1 to 5 minutes interviewing somebody to decide whether they were going to go on a voyage with them. With Shackleton, it was all gut. He would go by his feel of a person, and he cared far more for attitude and temperament than skills. And in fact, he did hire guys that were absolutely inferior to others in the skills compartment, but they had a good attitude about him that led Shackleton to believe this is a man who could be counted on and that would be an asset to the team overall. That's who he went with. And I think leaders would do very well to hire for attitude and temperament wildly before skills. I am definitely learning that. I have learned that. I am continuing to learn it more and more as that principle is reinforced all the time. Now, I don't like Shackleton's way of just kind of like, going with his gut on dudes. I'm like, that would not work. I've been burned too much of like, I'm going to do some due diligence. So the kind of debonair way that he would go about it, I find would be wildly reckless and very, very damaging for me. I think it would be for you as well. Shackleton was able to do impossible exploits, and so let's put him as an outlier. I'm not like Shackleton, and neither are you. Only Shackleton is like Shackleton, and so he gets to do that. And the rest of us, let's do our good due diligence, because when it came to Shackleton following his gut, he was nearly always right. Now, some other attributes of Shackleton that are more replicable is he led from the front. He was never asking his men to do something that he wasn't willing to do as well. And so where he could have kind of had this hierarchical, I am the master and commander, and so are these other officers, so we don't have to stoop to do normal chores that might be enforced on a big ship. Nope. Everyone's taking turns. Everyone's doing the hard and humble work. He's also integrating himself with the troops, and he's eating with them and leading jokes and songs. He did stand apart from them. He was serious, but despite that natural distance, he would come and fraternize with the guys, and that was a good thing. That was a morale building thing. So he'd hang out with them, he'd be one of them, and then he would push off and be his reserved leader self. The principle is this: it's not just learning leadership as if you can crack the code on leading men like it's a Rubik's Cube. The best thing we can do is grow as individual men to be competent and decisive and correct in our assessments. That means experience is something that's going to be crucial, that you be willing to suffer with the men, that you be a hard worker. And basically, if you become someone worth following, people will follow you. I'd also say that Shackleton loved his men. They didn't come off in like a smushy Care Bear hug kind of way. This is like old, gritty, tough dude stuff where men knew you loved them because you risked your life for them, and you did the impossible on their behalf. And you're like, oh, he must like me. That type of suffering sacrifice doesn't happen unless there is an overflowing abundance of love. So I recognize Shackleton certainly loved his men. Now let me talk about some stuff that I didn't like about Shackleton. And so I don't like rosy bios where only the good stuff shines through. I'm like, no. Nobody's perfect but Jesus. Give me the ugly as well before you immortalize this person, because I recognize you can learn through the strengths of a man as well as his weaknesses. And so that's what I'm after here. One is I don't think Shackleton was a man of great faith, and that's really upsetting to me. There is an early part after his boat had been crushed. They were trapped out on the ice. This is before they had ventured to Elephant Island, and they knew they were going to have to carry the boats over this Arctic winterland hundreds of miles to be able to get into their boats and then be able to cross to hopefully find rescue. He gathered the men and said, "Men, I need you to get rid of every single ounce that isn't critically essential." And at that point, he pulled out a cigarette box. It was gold, so this would be very expensive. Gold cigarette box, and he threw it in the snow, as well as a few gold coins. Gold coins, that's very valuable. Threw it in the snow as well. Then he took a Bible, and he ripped a page from the book of Job out of it, and then threw the Bible in the snow as well. Now, some folks will be like, hey, he took a page from the book of Job. And so he's like, hey, he's still carrying some Bible, but he's got the condensed version. I'm like, no, well, not quite. I think a real man of faith would have brought his Bible. some of you won't like that, but I'll say, well, Shackleton did approve an 8-pound banjo. And you could say, well, that's for morale. I'm like, what do you think the Bible's for? What are they carrying? Like 100 pounds of tobacco with them too. They had tons of tobacco. And so don't give me the, no, you can't afford to do that. Like, no, one Bible for the group of people who desperately need the blessing of God. And here's what followed. He just took a page from the book of Job. Job is a book of suffering. And I wonder if he had taken the whole Bible, maybe he would have experienced the blessing found in other books. But instead, he chose a page from the book of suffering. And so God gave him suffering. That's my read. That's what I think happened. Shackleton's faith was in his own ability and that of his men. It wasn't in the Lord to save him. And I think he was made to suffer impossibly badly for it. It was a failed expedition. It was torturous suffering. And then Shackleton, once getting back from this journey, he continued his unsuccessful life as it had been before. He would have made a wonderful Army Ranger in this respect. Decisive, bold, courageous, and long-suffering. Is able to endure terrible pain that other men couldn't dream of. And he was terrible at life. That's an Army Ranger. Courageous and able to withstand great amounts of suffering, and then terrible at life. Shackleton was constantly in debt. He kept taking out all these business schemes, and none of them came to anything. When he died, he would die so wildly in debt. It'd be equivalent to today's standards in millions of dollars in debt. He'd die of heart failure at the age of 47, doing yet another expedition that he never really got to do. And he'd leave behind wife and children that I really couldn't find any information about. I don't know anything about him as a father or him as a husband, but I know wild detail about his exploits. I'm like, how successful was his marriage? How successful can your marriage be if you're always gone? We know of his failed business ventures. We know of his speaking engagements. We know a lot about his career. But I don't see a legacy of successful living. I see a survivor story. I see a man who was extremely strong in some noteworthy ways that I'm deeply inspired by. But this was a man wholly devoted to a singular mission, but not at all reaching for that balanced life that I so deeply ascribed to and am pining after. As I talk about in my book, The Warrior Poet Way, it's not about being great in that narrow vein. It's about being good and balanced in a broader way, and that means successful living. It's not just succeeding in a mission, it's succeeding in all the missions, which we expanded just call life. In the future, I plan on dropping other books that I'm reading on Twitter. Follow me at Twitter. I'm JohnLevel275. There's where I'm going to be posting books that I'm going to read so we could read them at the same time, and then maybe we'll jump in and I'll post something and we can talk back and forth about it. Leave comments down below. Did I miss Shackleton? Did I misjudge him in some ways? Or was I too harsh? Where do you disagree? What do you think about this great exploit? And what does it mean for you as a man here? Let's try not to talk about woe is us, the world is awful. Let's try, for just a refreshing change, to step up in some accountability and say, no. Let me make this about me and my journey to become better, to become stronger. That's what I want to do. I don't want to rail against the world in this video. I want to rail against me. And I hope that you'll do the same.